Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and a very warm welcome to the University of Winchester and to tonight's event. My name's Joy Carter, I'm the Vice-Chancellor, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here on this special occasion. So tonight is a very special inaugural professorial event, and we have with us leading animal welfare campaigner and dear friend of this university, Professor Philip Lymbery, together with his wife, which is lovely. More about Philip in a minute, but let me first say something about the university. This is a cathedrals group university, and we hope that you find we're rooted in compassion, because compassion is one of our core values and is endlessly important to us. And we say this about our value of compassion. We say, conscious of the kinship that exists between all life, we seek to nurture compassion for people, for animals, and for our planet. I'd like to say that again. Conscious of the kinship that exists between all life, we seek to nurture compassion for people, animals, and the planet. It's actually for all life. So Philip's work, and indeed the work of compassion in world farming, is right at the heart of what this university is about. Because we care passionately about the world about us. At the university, our teaching and research is geared towards tackling global challenges. Our lovely students leave us confident to challenge convention, shake up the world and really make a difference. And all this is part of what's driven our ambition to be amongst those leading the way in animal welfare. Last year, we launched one of the first centres for animal welfare in the United Kingdom. And our mascot, our lovely mascot, is over there high-fiving you. Can you see it? Our beagle. It undertakes groundbreaking research into important and, I have to say, sometimes controversial animal welfare issues. We're not afraid of that. But I'm sure you know that animal welfare doesn't exist in a convenient bubble. We'll hear more about that tonight. It is, of course, linked to food choices, to extinction of species, and to the very future of our planet. Philip's is a hard-hitting, life-changing message. And if you don't go away from tonight in some way changed, however small, I'd be very surprised. So what of Philip? Well, you'll hear a lot more about his life and work this evening, but let me just say this, that Philip's been a campaigner and an activist on these sort of issues for decades. He's worked at Compassion in World Farming, one of the leading organisations in the field globally, for over 20 years, and he's now their chief executive. We're honoured as a university to have Philip as a visiting professor. We're honoured also to work alongside Joyce Da Silva, who's one of our honorary doctors. Joyce was the former chief executive of Compassion in World Farming, and she's with us tonight as well. So Philip's last book was called Farmageddon, and in that he laid bare the truths about the catalogue of devastation caused by industrial farming across the globe. I'm not sure he knew how it would be received, but my goodness, it was like a whirlwind all over the world of people being interested and fascinated and challenged and really knocked to the core of their thinking. It was just amazing. And it's a good read as well. And it's on sale outside. That's my commercial. So that was his first book. Now his second book, here it is. I've got it with me to wave at you. This is also on sale outside. Dead Zone. What a wonderful title. Where the Wild Things Were. It was launched on the world just last week. And in this book, Philip takes the message even further, looking at the impact that industrial farming is having on the plight of iconic species around the globe. We'll hear more about this tonight. Let me just say this. Philip is hugely respected all around the world for this work, and it's a huge pleasure and an honour to have him with us here tonight and as a visiting professor of this university. It's a pleasure for the institution, but it's a pleasure for me personally as well. Now, just before I ask you to welcome Philip, let me tell you a little bit about the plan for this evening. So Philip will make a presentation. Then he'll be joined up here by Professor Andrew Knight, who's director of our Centre for Animal Welfare, for a discussion. That's what those chairs are doing there. And then we'll invite you to ask Philip questions. Ladies and gentlemen, enough of me. Please welcome Professor Philip Lymbery.
Thank you so much, Professor Carter. Thank you so much for a very warm and generous introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. I have to say I feel vindicated on two accounts, actually, this evening, seeing so many friends and people interested in the subject. The first is that when we came up with Farmageddon, the publisher lived with that and went along with that, actually embraced that. When I came up with Dead Zone, the publisher said, "Dead Zone? No one will come out to hear something about Dead Zone." And I said, "Oh, yes, they will. They'll think it's a Stephen King novel." The second reason I feel vindicated tonight is standing here in the university and with such a warm and generous introduction to talk about the plight of wildlife and farm animals. I feel vindicated because, that whole wildlife thing, I just remember how many school reports I took home where my mum would read out in horror. Philip really could do better if only he stopped staring out the window looking at birds. So I'm glad that all of that staring out of the classroom actually stood me in good stead for this evening and for this journey that I'd like to tell you about, because the last 2 years have been a real eye-opener for me. Compassion in World Farming, the charity that I've been proud to be associated with for more than 20 years now, asked me to front up the organisation and go around the world and undertake a global investigation into how factory farming affects not just farm animals, but also wildlife. And I'd like to share some of that with you right now. And I'd like to begin where the book starts, which is in the 18th century on Easter Island. Picture the scene. September in the South Pacific, and a life or death competition is about to begin. Nervous youths wait for the cue to throw themselves headlong into the ocean. They will risk drowning, shark attacks, or falling to their deaths. Before them, teeming with seabirds, are near inaccessible islets. There, across a mile of treacherous oceans, lies the prize. The first sooty tern egg of the year. Now, in 18th century Easter Island, winning the egg race would bring great kudos to the victorious youth. His sponsoring chief would be treated like a deity, and when he died, a stone sculpture would be raised in his memory. It was all part of an extraordinary culture that lasted for centuries before going bust. They ate plenty of fish, which they caught using canoes made of hollowed out tree trunks. Their population grew, and as it grew, they began to fell the forests to make way for fields to grow crops. When the last of the trees was felled, when it disappeared, so too did their means of fishing. The islanders found themselves at once marooned and impoverished. Nevertheless, the population continued to grow until it outstripped the carrying capacity of the land to provide enough food. When Captain Cook arrived in 1774, he found the islanders poverty-stricken, at each other's throats, and down to a fraction of their peak population. The islanders must have asked themselves, had the gods betrayed them, or had they betrayed themselves? The warning of Easter Island, as it's become known, is seen as something which has striking similarities to the challenges facing us as a global society. Here on Earth, life has thrived for billions of years. In the blink of an evolutionary eye, one species has emerged to dominate the planet: us. Our impact is now so great that scientists warn that we are heading for a mass extinction event not seen since the last days of the dinosaurs. Wildlife losses are being driven largely by food production. And over the last 50 years, we have seen the emergence of a new and particularly destructive form of agriculture, industrial agriculture, factory farming. I'd like to show you just a couple of minutes to give you a flavour of some of the things that I found in the course of writing the book Dead Zone. Warnings of hostage-taking, shootings and arrests. This makes me angry, very angry. A shocking indictment. Because you wouldn't know that that's going on. You wouldn't know that's part of industrial farming. The road from hell. We're well and truly stuck. 1 in 5 children are facing hunger, yet food has never been cheaper. One, there's nothing for them to eat, and 2, poison. Now, despite all that doom and gloom, there is really a story of hope here. Because what I'd like to share with you is that we all have the power to end an awful lot of farm animal suffering and save endangered wildlife right here, right now. It's as simple as the choices we make about our food. And in so doing, we can also leave a better legacy for future generations, a planet worth having. And it's as simple as choosing to buy pasture-fed, free-range or organic meat, milk and eggs. Let me explain. You see, factory farming has 2 sides. And over the last 50 years, factory farming has come to be a dominant way of keeping farm animals. There are 2 sides. One is where the animals are kept, often caged, crammed or confined, in conditions where they may not be able to stretch their wings, turn around, or express their natural behaviours. And this emerged after the Second World War and was seen as a space-saving idea. Take the animals off of the pasture and put them in cages. But what was overlooked, and is still widely overlooked, is that by taking the animals off the land, you have to grow their feed elsewhere, often in chemical-soaked prairies, be it of cereals, of soya and other crops. And when one does that, when one puts the animals in the cages or the crowded barns, grows their feed elsewhere, you set off a cascade of cruelty, as I see it. The farm animals disappear from the land, and to grow their feed, so too do the trees, the hedges, the bushes, the wildflowers, the seeds, the insects, the birds, the bats, the bees, the penguins, the jaguars, the elephants, as we will see shortly, leaving us with little else but the crop. "40 years ago, I fell in love with wildlife. I turned as many of my school projects as I could into forays out to look for wildlife. I turned holidays into mini safaris, and I hitched rides to places which felt exotic faraway lands like Norfolk. And there I would find the object of my desire. As any teenager will tell you, the thing which you're really looking for are things like skylarks and grey partridges and barn owls. Okay, I was a geeky kid, but bear with me. The sad fact is that over my lifetime, the things which I've been looking for so eagerly have been disappearing before my very eyes. In the last 50 years, Britain has lost 44 million birds. That's a breeding pair lost every minute. Now, conservation organisations like the RSPB that I love, and the wildlife trusts that I support also, do fantastic conservation work, bringing rare birds back from the brink and making them things which we can all enjoy again. Birds like the red kite and the avocet. But the sad truth is that conservation success stories in bringing rare birds back from the brink in no way makes up for the massive losses of once common farmland birds. Farmland covers most of our land surface, 70% in fact. So what happens on that land surface matters. But it doesn't have to be like this. One of the things which has been driving it has been this industrialization of agriculture, taking animals off the land and the cascade of cruelty. But it doesn't have to be like this. And I was reminded of this when our neighbour came round for breakfast, a neighbouring farmer. I'll name him because he's in the book, George Atkinson. George, if you're here, thank you for coming round that day. And he polished off several large mugs of tea and everything I could put on the table. And we had a conversation, a longer conversation than I've ever had with him, because usually the conversations with him are hurried, where he's shouting out of his pickup. And we're often talking about how the local cricket team is getting on, or how what colour my wife's hair is, or how his barn owls are doing. I asked him round for breakfast that day because I wanted to hear about the barn owls. And when he came in, he said to me, "Philip, I've just been talking to the local RSPB, and I've just been telling them about what's happening with the farmland birds on my farm." And I said, "Well, what's the story there?" He said, "Well, we're bucking the trend. Birds are coming back. The numbers are getting better, bucking the trend against what's happening in the rest of the country." And I said, "Well, George, that's amazing. What's your secret?" And he said to me, "Philip, it's not rocket science. It's mixed farming. That's what I do." And by that, what he meant was he has a mix of farm animals and crops that move in rotation around the farm, creating habitats, decent hedges, spinneys and copses. He leaves areas where butterflies can thrive, insects and seeds, and so the birds come back. He has a living countryside here in the Meon Valley. But you see, I think increasingly over the decades, we've been losing sight of the power of pasture. And there's a wonderful historical example of the power of pasture. And that was something which I learned when I was in the US. The US, the Midwest of the US, of course, has got Great Plains that go on seemingly forever. And in the 1800s, those Great Plains were the domain of bison. About 50 million bison roamed those Great Plains in vast herds, moving constantly. A wonderful indictment of the nitrogen cycle, where they would eat the grass and they would put fertility back in the soil. Those bison had the combined weight of the entire human population of North America today. And they were powered by nothing more than rain, sunshine, and grass. Perfect, sustainable harmony. But then what happened? Well, the US had its migration crisis. European settlers came in and within a few short years wiped out the bison. They're now holed up as refugees in wonderful places, but refugees nonetheless in places like Yellowstone National Park. The Great Plains, as I found out, as I clambered into a huge tractor with more technology than a space shuttle, is now what the farmer beside me described as a flowing green ocean of corn, as far as the eye could see. Most of that corn is going to feed cattle. Much of the rest goes to feed cars. A small amount of it goes to feed people. I saw some of the cattle that this corn was feeding. I had in mind the Great Plains, the wandering herds. Then I thought, no, it must be cowboys, Stetsons, big ranches. The ones I saw in Nebraska, ubiquitous by the roadside, had 1,000 or more cattle standing in a single dusty feedlot paddock. Despite the midsummer Nebraskan sun beating down, they had no shelter. With all of the cattle there, I thought, this is going to be noisy. I stepped out of the car, and it was hush, eerie hush. That hush was broken only by the odd cough or wail or sneeze of the animals. And I looked at them there, and I saw them desperately trying to lie in each other's shadows to get out of the searing heat. As I drove away, I found myself picking cattle ticks and putting them compassionately out of the window. That, to me, feels like the animal feed industry having taken over, hijacked the food industry. And I saw how pernicious that could be when I went to Brazil. In Brazil, I was on the trail of the jaguar. And when I got there, I drove past first cattle pastures, forests intermingled, and then suddenly the land flattened out and it was just a constant flat prairie of chemical-soaked soya. And I knew that much of it was GM. It would have been anonymous if it weren't for proud signs by the roadside announcing the latest biotech invention. And you see, what's happening in Brazil is that soya fields are sweeping the landscape, hundreds of thousands of hectares every year of expansion. And that expansion is going on into cattle pastures, which displaces the cattle in Brazil further into the Amazon, causing greater deforestation. Now, sadly, cattle and jaguars don't mix. So when the cattle get displaced into the rainforest, not only does their habitat go, but the remaining jaguars, there's only 15,000 of them left. The remaining jaguars are forced more into conflict with the new cattle ranchers, who see them as a pest, and the jaguars are shot on sight. But I remember, Brazil is one of the countries that I hugely warmed to, and I remember going to the Pantanal And on a typical compassion budget, I didn't have long to stay in the Pantanal. In fact, I had one night. And to get to that one night on the Pantanal where I was told I'd have my best chance of seeing jaguars, I had to negotiate the 100-mile-long Transpantanera road. So I slipped and slid in this four-wheel drive, going across 124 creaky bridges. And as I was going, I left before dawn. And I remember seeing the sun rising like a fireball, and it sprinkled intense spits of orange light across a shimmering landscape. And all around was an explosion of life. Wonderful. Nightjars performed their last flutter in the half-light, like half-seen shadows. Kingfishers darted for their breakfast. Jacanas danced on lily pads. Limpkins, like big brown herons, were picking in the shallows. Family parties of the world's biggest rodent were walking nonchalantly beside the car, the capybara, looking for all the world like giant guinea pigs. As I hope you can tell, I loved it in Porto Joffre. I could have stayed there forever. I never did see a jaguar, but I did learn much more about their plight. And whilst I was there, I fell to wondering how many people actually recognize the fact that the reason so much rainforest and so much savanna is disappearing is to grow soya for factory farmed animals here in the UK and in Europe and other parts of the world. Because the bitter truth is that cheap meat is often powered by the deforested plains of South America. I settled down for my one night at Porto Joffre, and the hotelier brought me a brochure. He realized I hadn't seen the jaguar, and I don't know whether he was trying to be helpful or whether he was rubbing it in, but there in the center was a wonderful picture of jaguars being photographed by tourists. And these eager tourists, they come in from all around the world. They come in from Italy, from Germany, from the UK, from the US, eager, like I would be, to see the jaguar and to capture the picture. And as I looked at that picture, I couldn't help wondering how many of those tourists had arrived to see the jaguar and had arrived stoked up on cheap meat from soya-fed animals. You see, to me, industrial agriculture is like a great bulldozer that's sweeping across the planet. Half of the usable land surface of the planet is growing food, is agriculture. And as more and more of that land is swept by this industrial type of farming, it's like a bulldozer sweeping away everything before it. It's perhaps no accident that in the 50 years since factory farming was widely adopted, we on this planet have lost half of all our wildlife. We are on course within a few short years to make that 2/3 of all our wildlife. When I was writing the book, what I also discovered is that this is often defended. Factory farming is often defended by this idea that we need to produce more food to feed more people. Well, it doesn't stack up for two reasons. One, because that arable land that's growing those animal feed could be used for growing crops or for mixed farming directly for people. And that animal feed that we feed to industrially reared animals by taking them off the land, where they were previously converting grass into things we can eat, like meat, milk, and eggs. In that equation, we're currently feeding enough human edible crops to farm animals that could otherwise feed 4 billion people on the planet. And they don't do it efficiently. They waste most of the calories and the protein in the conversion. So the biggest area of food waste on the planet, bar none, is in feeding human edible crops to industrially reared animals. How far this has gone, I learned when I was in Sumatra. And boy, I knew the trip was going to be hard, but I didn't quite realize how. I got there and the airline had managed to lose my luggage. So I spent 10 days traipsing through jungle and forest with just the clothes I was stood up in. Pity my companions. I was bitten by leeches. I slept rough in the jungle or in cockroach-ridden hotels. And I think to cap it all, I found that for the first part of the trip, I had an interpreter that didn't speak English. Given that I was writing a book, that wasn't very helpful. But to cap it all, Sumatra had one last surprise for me. It was right at the end of the trip. It was the last day, and I decided that I wanted to go back to a specific part of the palm plantation to do some final research before getting on the plane. And we'd arranged to go back. They knew we were coming. And when we got there, I just remember shortly afterwards hearing this ominous rustle, seemingly all around. And instinct took over and I just ran. And as I did so, I heard this deafening crash behind me, and then a powerful slap around the back of my head, which turned out to be the canopy of a tree. I turned round to see that a large tree had fallen just where I'd been standing. But despite it all, we got the story, and this is it. We're here in Medan, in northern Sumatra, on the trail of Sumatra's last remaining elephants. Elephants are always on the move. They need a large, continuous, connected forest habitat to feed and support them. What they are finding increasingly is that they have isolated patches of forest surrounded by industrial palm plantations. It's just not enough to sustain them.
They can't live in palm plantation. They need forest. Forest is their home. Plantation is not their home. They need forest to eat, to breed. They cannot eat palm trees.
So what I've discovered is that part of the reason why this forest is gone is because factory farmed animals, caged, crammed and confined in Europe, are being fed on the palm kernel. As the forest shrinks, there are more and more troublesome elephants. That's how the locals see them, getting out into the farmland. And if they can't be got back into the forest, some are poisoned or shot, others are captured, taken to what they call the training centre and enlisted in the patrols to help keep the wild elephants where they should be, in the wild. Some captured elephants are kept in tourist resorts and eco-centres, but this does nothing to support the wider population of elephants, whose numbers in the wild are rapidly declining, just so we can continue to feed our appetite for palm and for cheap meat and dairy.
Well, I think the future of the Sumatran elephant is really quite bleak right now. It needs large areas of lowland forest. Simple as that. They move long distances, they have long migration routes, and currently, even if not all of their habitat is being taken, if their travel routes are cut, they will come into conflict with people, and always, inevitably, the wildlife loses in the end.
Ending factory farming will help take the pressure of hard-pressed forests and give iconic wildlife, like the Sumatran elephant, the chance of a future. So, whilst it may feel a bit of a stretch, actually I hope you can see that through the food choices we make, we really can make a difference to the farm animals that are kept in factory farms, to the wildlife close by in our countryside, and also to iconic wildlife like jaguars, elephants and penguins on faraway continents. And you know, this really is a story of hope, because to stop that farm animal suffering, to save those wild animals and leave a legacy for our children, really is something that can be a wonderful win-win situation. You know, when we put farm animals back on the land, amazing things start to happen. The farm animals can express their natural behaviors. They can run and they can jump. They can stretch their wings. They can bathe in the dust. They can wallow in the mud if they want to. And done right, they can have fantastic welfare. And in returning these animals to the land in mixed rotational farms, you know, which isn't rocket science, but it is a wonderful way to produce food, we also start to see our landscape coming back to life. We start to see soil fertility bouncing back naturally. And you know, we have to recognize that soil is something which is ebbing away. The UN says that we've got 60 years left in the world's soils. You know, what then? So putting animals back on the land brings the worms and other soil-enhancing animals back. You reconnect with the nitrogen cycle. Start to see the wild flowers come back. And with those wild flowers comes the seeds that propel so much of our wildlife. And we also give the sustenance that we need to pollinators that pollinate a third of all the crops in the world that we eat. In so doing, we start bringing back the birds that feed on the insects and the seeds, and the other wildlife, the mammals, the bats, the butterflies. And the wonderful thing about grass as part of a mixed rotation or on permanent pasture is that it has deep root systems which make the landscape more resilient to drought, absorbing water and therefore less susceptible to flooding. What that also does is holds in the soil and stops it running into our rivers, stops pollution getting into our rivers. So our rivers start to be cleaner again. They start to be flourishing in wildlife like the water crowfoot, the water vole that has declined in this country as fast as the East African rhino. And we also start to see the lazy sway of the native brown trout coming back. Now, the great thing about putting farm animals back on the land in the right way is that we also take pressure, as we've seen in the film, of hard-pressed forests near and far, so that forests can do those things that we often don't notice, perhaps until they're gone, like taking carbon out of the atmosphere and giving us oxygen to breathe. So I think the message that I'd like to leave you with is that the best animal welfare, putting farm animals back on the land in the right way, really does bring landscapes to life. It brings quality of life, a life worth living, the joy of living, to those farm animals. It helps save iconic wildlife for future generations. And frankly, it preserves the sustainability and the quality of our food for us today and for our children tomorrow. Thank you very much.
I'd like to start by saying thank you so much, Philip, for that wonderful presentation. As you would have detected from our Vice-Chancellor's introduction, at the university here we care passionately about issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss and animal welfare, and it really is quite a thrill, I think, to have one of the world champions in the struggle against biodiversity loss and intensive farming to be joining us here tonight. So delighted that Philip survived the falling tree and all the other mishaps he clearly had to be able to be with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I have a few questions for Philip. I've had the great pleasure of reading the book over the last week, and I must say, very impressed, of course, by how very thorough and well referenced and well cited it all is. Obviously, enormous amounts of work have gone into that, but I was particularly enjoying just the story of Philip's adventures, because Philip has effectively gone on a series of fairly dramatic adventures around different parts of the globe, trying to track down and as you've heard, sometimes failing to actually spot these increasingly endangered species. And he's had some very interesting experiences along the way, which are all recounted in the book and make it much more interesting than it would have otherwise been. So I'm very, very grateful, actually, that all those have been there. But I'd like to start really by asking you, Philip, about the Sumatran jungles, because it seems that from your account in the book, there was quite a lot of blood-sucking insects and other unpleasant experiences in the jungles. And as somebody who's had issues with blood-sucking mosquitoes, I understand how they prefer some people to others. And I'm just wondering, Philip, do you feel the leeches had a preference towards you? And as an animal lover yourself, how does that make you feel about the leeches in return?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Andrew. Thank you so much. And I ought to say, as I'm here at the Centre for Animal Welfare and, of course, heading up Compassion in World Farming, I need to be very clear. No leeches were hurt in the making of this book. I mean, honestly, they do make you bleed like you wouldn't believe. And I don't think they had a preference for me. I mean, one of the unsung heroes of this project was very much my camera person, a lady called Katie Millward, who was really, the leeches were a fan of hers. And, they went for her in all sorts of places. And I just remember her screaming because there was only her as the female. The rest of us were men and the mahouts and what have you. And I just remember going, I've got leeches all over me. And these are all men. I've got no help. And she did look like she'd come out of the jungle, out of the battle zone rather than...
Well, thank goodness you both survived. One of many difficult challenges in this amazing story. I was quite interested actually in the focus in your book on penguins as well as the leeches. As a Southern Hemisphere person myself from Australia, I feel a bit of affinity with penguins, which primarily are in the Southern Hemisphere, but it wasn't what I was expecting in a book about factory farming. And I have to say, I was wondering why the focus on penguins and how factory farming could possibly affect penguins.
Yeah, well, that's another great question. And I remember when I wrote Farmageddon, Farmageddon had a lot of stuff that I think we were presenting in a mainstream way, but most of it was already out there in some shape or form, perhaps not in the mainstream. But I'd like to think the Dead Zone has got a lot of stuff that even people who, like me, work in the field, there'll be things which you just don't know. I didn't know that penguins were affected by factory farming, and how they're affected is that huge quantities of fish like anchovies and pilchards, small pelagic fish, are scooped out, vast quantities, and they're rendered down into animal feed. And what we're essentially doing is we're taking the food away from puffins and penguins. So puffins in the northern hemisphere, and other seabirds, penguins in the southern hemisphere. This is well documented, and if you're ever communicating this story to other people, if there's a so what factor, well, the interesting thing is that big fish, the fish that we put on our plate, is of course down to 10% of their historical populations. We've fished the ocean of 90% of the fish. But we hope that one day the pressure will come off them and they will bounce back. And if they are to bounce back, then we need to give them something to eat, because it's not just penguins and puffins that eat those small fish. It's the fish that we put on our plate too. So as it is, we're on course to lose commercial fisheries by 2048. So this is why it's all intertwined. Farm animal cruelty, fed on fish meal, penguins being starved to death, and the sustainability of our food system being undermined.
Thank you. I was also struck by your account of being in Brazil and being in the very small aircraft flying over the soya monocultures, actually, and just seeing how much forests have been destroyed in savannah. You've described a bit about why the Amazonian jungle is so important, really, to the rest of us. Can you tell us a bit what it was like just looking out of that aircraft and seeing what you saw? Because I know it was quite dramatic.
Well, it was mind-blowing. I was up high, and so seeing whole landscapes that literally before you went on for many miles. And at first there's pristine forest, and that's all you see. And then you start seeing little chunks having been nibbled out of it. And then a little further into the journey, you see that actually it's the other way around, that there are now just crop fields and tiny chunks of forest, like isolated islands in the middle of a sea of soya. And, I couldn't help thinking that is that bulldozer scenario of industrial agriculture sweeping across that landscape. And no wonder we're losing so much of the world's wildlife.
And how far did that extend, where there would have been forest and natural savanna previously?
Oh, well, this went on. Brazil is a massive country, and that went on for many miles. And a town mayor who I was on the plane with said to me, "Look, we're losing the lungs of the earth," is what he said to me. And I think it's worth noting that in South America, the soya fields alone that are dedicated to growing feed for European farm animals, those soya fields, if you put them all together, would cover an area the size of a country like Greece.
So the lungs of the earth in a country like Greece. Fantastic, thank you. Awful situation. We often hear today the concept of sustainable intensification, which seems to be driving a lot of this, actually, as a way to try to feed the growing human population whilst concurrently trying to preserve the environment and animal welfare at the same time. Just wondering, this concept of sustainable intensification of animal farming, how realistic do you think that is? Do you think that's an oxymoron? Do you think that's something that's truly possible?
Yeah. Well, sustainable intensification is the latest buzzword that the government, the European Commission, and governments increasingly worldwide are trying to use to sell greater intensification, greater industrialization. So I very much think it's an oxymoron. And they try to sell us this sustainable intensification, more of what we've been talking about, on the basis of we need to produce more food, we need to double food production. But the reality is, and we ran the numbers for the book, we used the UN's own database, and the reality is that there's 7 billion people today. We're going to be 9 or 10 billion by the middle of this century. The food system already produces enough food for 16 billion people. We just waste more than half of it, and the biggest proportion of waste is in feeding human edible crops to factory farmed animals. So one, sustainable intensification is an oxymoron that's being used to sell factory farming. Why don't they just call it a spade and be honest with us? And the second is that the rationale for need, I think, is self-serving, serves the feed companies, the drug companies, the chemical companies that generally profit from big agriculture on the scale we're talking.
In your book, you met a great many interesting characters, and one of those characters was a young man called Chris Darwin, who is the great-great-grandson of Charles Darwin, who's attributed as helping to formulate the theory of evolution. Now, Chris is also a passionate defender of endangered species, and like you, Philip, seems to have a somewhat glamorous lifestyle of travelling around the world and doing potentially dangerous things. Chris is actually a sort of professional rock climber, and he's also promoted the sport of extreme dining, which is where you have black-tie dinner parties on the top of mountains and in other exotic locations. Now, I understand that Chris is interested in having another black-tie dinner party high up in the branches of a Californian redwood in Yosemite Valley to help publicise the endangered species in California. And Philip, after producing this book and promoting it around the world, I think you're probably at quite some risk of receiving an invitation to a dinner party like that, along with the other naturalists that will be going. So I'm wondering if that did occur, would you be willing to go up the redwood tree, and what would you choose to have for dinner?
Oh, wow, yeah. Well, Chris Darwin is an amazing fellow. He's enthusiastic, he's a little bit crazy, dresses up in bear suits to prove that there's illegal shooting of bears going on. And he also told me about one of his high dinner parties. I think it broke a world record high on a Peruvian mountain. And he said the only things which went wrong, Philip, were that the wine froze and 2 of the guests got hypothermia during the pudding course. So would I go with him up in the redwood tree? Yeah, I would. I'd like a taste of that. That sounds fun. It sounds adventurous. What would
you have for dinner?
What would I have for dinner? Well, whatever it was, it would be pasture-fed, free-range, or organic. That would be what I would be insisting upon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So it's quite clear that if you have a lifestyle such as Philip's, you get to travel around the world, saving endangered species and having a fairly glamorous existence. Now, I'm sure that probably appeals quite a lot to many of our own students here at the university who are just as passionate as we are, to be honest, about issues like environmental sustainability, animal welfare and species loss. So if any of our students wanted to try to follow in your footsteps, Philip, and have the sort of career that you've had, is there any advice that you'd be able to give them?
Well, keep trying and don't take no for an answer is what I would say. There's a big world that needs more people that want to get the compassionate environmental message out there. And I just remember Joyce De Silva is here. She hired me, but it wasn't a straightforward hire. I went for the job, and I remember getting the phone call, and she said, "I'm sorry you didn't get the job, but we were impressed with your enthusiasm, even though you didn't have the qualifications. So we'd like to offer you another job. Okay, it's doing the filing and making the tea. But would you take it?" And I took it with both hands. So I would say, be very single-minded in what you're looking to do, and take your chances, whatever they look like, and build on them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
At this point, I'd like to ask for just a couple of questions, actually, from anyone in the audience that would like to ask Philip some questions. Now, we do have roving microphones, so if you have a question, if you wouldn't mind just popping your hand up, and everyone will be able to hear you that way. Thank you. Just one up there.
I don't need a microphone, but I've got a very quick question. I've never asked a question in my life.
You have a quick question, please. What's your question?
Certainly not to Mars, but I would never ask a question.
All right. What's your question?
If you just go with Chris Darwin up the tree,
Up the tree, yep.
who would you invite?
Well, my wife, of course.
Okay. Right answer.
Jolly good. You won't be left out. Fantastic. Okay, there's a question in the middle up there.
One word you didn't mention, that's overpopulation. You touched on it in part of the discussion. Do you think it can really just carry on exponentially? What can we do about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the reality is that we live on a finite planet, so there is no room for more of more. Simple as that. And I think that in terms of population, we have to also recognize, and I go into this, there's a chap, the book goes through chapter by chapter, iconic species. So each chapter is themed like this. One on elephant, one on penguin. There's one near the end called Homo sapiens. And there I draw out some of the issues you're touching on, but particularly the fact that there are 2 population explosions going on. So with every 1 billion extra people there is on the planet, those people come with 10 billion extra farm animals. 10 billion extra farm animals. We're already using half the world's usable land to produce food. We're seeing the consequences of that. So that's why the message is around eating less and better meat, milk and eggs, to try and get the food system back in balance on this finite planet. Because I think the answer to your question is that there is not room on this planet for more of more, whatever it is.
Thank you. Is there another question? Gentleman has his hand up right there, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Philip, if you were able to design it, how would you design the future of a countryside stewardship system, or would you not have one at all?
What a great question. Well, you probably guessed the answer there. I would construct it around encouraging production, land-based animal production, where the animals are kept in balance with the landscape in pasture-fed, free-range or organic systems, integrated with crops. And I would encourage the kind of moves that I talk about in the book by another farmer, actually, who's quite local to here in Basingstoke. He's got a very, very big farm, 10 times the average UK farm, and it was all intensive arable. It was, those prairie-like croplands that I was describing. His name is Tim May. And he realized that his soils were deteriorating, that it didn't matter how much he bombed the crop with chemicals, and he bombed it every year with 9 different types of chemical. 700 pounds a hectare worth of chemicals. That's a lot of arsenal. He realized that it didn't matter what he did to his crops, his yields were still going down. So what did he do? He took it upon himself to reintroduce grazing animals and to reintroduce them on a rotational basis. And he's found that his soil fertility is coming back, that the wildlife is coming back, and he's feeling good about what he's doing. He's a real pioneer. So I would like to see, rather than locked into a particular type of scheme, like a countryside stewardship scheme, I would like to see all support to agriculture in Britain post-Brexit going towards encouraging land-based rotational farming.
Thank you very much. We're running a little short on time. I know that Philip is going to be outside afterwards signing books for anyone that would like one of his books, and I do highly commend them for the reasons that I mentioned. I'm sure he'd be very pleased to take any further questions then, especially if you bought one of his highly commended books. So I'd like at this point to ask Philip to share with us actually a little reading that he's got from his book as we start to close proceedings tonight. So thank you for those answers,
Thank
Philip.
you.
Thanks for
Thank
putting
you
up my
so much.
questions. Cheers.
Thank you. So, yeah, I should say that all royalties from the book go to the charity, Compassion in World Farming, to help us continue to get the message out there. And I'd like to just leave you, really, with a reading from the book called The Joy of Being Alive. I've clung to perilous cliff edges, bobbed around in boats, and spent hours crouching by rain-soaked rocks to watch peregrines on Lundy. But one moment stands out. It was a raw morning in late May with a stiff northeasterly wind. Emerging from our cottage beside the Morisco Tavern, I was wearing thick fleece and woolly hat and armed as ever with camera and binoculars. I wandered through my usual bird-watching routine, scouring the bushes for small migrants, past the marshy area where you can see ducks and the odd water rail. before doubling back toward Milcombe Valley, a richly vegetated gorge that runs to the sea. I made my way past along the horse fields till I reached the fence that runs along the top of Milcombe Valley. As I went through the gate, a flash of wings whooshed right past my face. Startled, I leapt back and grabbed my binoculars. A dark, angular shape rose sharply, twisting and turning. As the shape hung in the headwind, I could see it was a male peregrine, now motionless, wings like boomerangs, tail clenched and head swiveling. I watched in awe as the bird positioned himself to make the legendary peregrine stoop. He closed his wings and plunged like a bullet. Boy, was he fast. I tried to keep him in my binoculars, but I just couldn't. He was that quick. In an instant, he'd shot across the valley, soared high again, and then dived steeply to pull up within a whisker of the grassy hillside. He rose triumphantly, banked, and with a ripple of wings, shot across the fields. A heartbeat, and he was out of sight. I was stunned. I'd just watched an adult peregrine at play. It seemed the aerodynamics were pure joy. He had no prey in sight, no hapless pigeon or puffin. He wasn't being chased. He dived in the wind apparently for the sheer joy of it. This, to me, is where the environment and animal welfare meet. Animal welfare, like a living countryside, is a positive state, a joyful one. It is an environment to which animals have the freedom to express themselves naturally, to behave naturally, to be themselves. Animal welfare is about a positive state of well-being. Yes, being free from disease or injury or distress is essential. These things, though, should be a given on any decent farm. But the absence of demonstrable suffering is not enough. What really should shine through is the scope to do what comes naturally, grazing, scratching at the ground, or, in the case of the peregrine, closing wings and hurtling at utmost speed just for fun. As that exhilarating Lundy peregrine reminded me, what's really important is the joy of being alive. Surely it's not too much to ask for farm animals too. I just want to thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you so much to Professor Carter for hosting us. It's an extreme privilege for me. Thank you to Professor Knight, for the conversation, and for all of you. I really do think that amazing things happen when we put farm animals back on the land in the right way. Amazing for them, as you've just seen, they can really express themselves and enjoy life. Amazing for wildlife that can come flooding back to a living countryside. Amazing for our food, which can be better quality, more taste, more flavour, more nutrition. And I think crucially, we can all help leave a decent legacy, one really worth having for the next generation, for our children and our children's children. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Liz Stewart. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and I'm still weeping from that film. It's my pleasure, on behalf of all of us here tonight, to offer thanks to Philip for such an inspiring and evocative and challenging and hopeful evening. At the beginning of the session, the Vice-Chancellor read out our value on compassion, which talks about the kinship of all life. And Philip, in your description of the cascade of cruelty, you perfectly illustrated that kinship. But it's that kinship that, as you rightly point out, that also gives us hope. Because the decisions that you and I make about what we buy, about what we eat, can make a difference to animals and to people on the other side of the world. We can make a difference. We must make a difference. Philip, thank you for this evening, and thank you for all that you do to make a difference. Thank you.